My very first job was at a municipal swimming pool. It had a big concrete grandstand on one side where swim teams would sit during swim meets, like big steps. Underneath that was all the big pool equipment. Opposite of the grandstand was another set of steps. There were some picnic tables and the concession stand and the office. Around the whole thing was a chain link fence. And my job, underneath the concession stand area, there was a dark, kind of dingy, musty room that when you opened the old rusty metal doors was how you got into the pool. And my job was either to sit there and check people's passes or take their money, or to work in the concession stand. The extent of my swimming skill at that point was doggy paddling, and when that's all you can do, you don't get to be a lifeguard. Ironic then that I worked at the very pool where years earlier as a child I had been terrorized by swim lessons. My mom would sit on the bleachers outside that chain link fence and watch as these people would, in my opinion, lie to me because they would say, "Jump in, we'll catch you." And then I remember them dunking me, trying to get me used to the water. Hated it. I was not committed to learning how to swim, so I did not learn how to swim. Also, there were 3 diving boards, 2 lower ones and a high one. On the low dive, I would go up to the edge of it, turn toward the ladder, jump as far as I could, so I only had to doggy paddle a little bit. The high dive, I was not going to do that. But they were a lot of pressure, right? So I would climb that ladder, and I still don't like heights, so that was enough of a terror. But then I would walk out to the end, look down, and know, A, how far it is from the ladder, B, don't know how deep I'm going, and if I can get back to the surface. So I'm pretty sure I cried and would turn around until they let me climb back down the ladder. I was not committed to doing that. Eventually, I did go off the high dive, but I was not committed to the lessons or to the high dive, right? Today, we get a passage from the Gospels where Jesus has set his face to Jerusalem. He knows where he's going. Someone comes up and said, "I'll follow you anywhere you go." And Jesus says, kind of like, "Are you sure about that? I don't have a place to lay my head." And then he looks at someone else and says, "Come and follow me." And they say, "Well, I'd love to, but first let me go bury my dad." And Jesus has this kind of harsh response, right? Let the dead bury the dead. And then someone else says, "Well, I'll follow you." And he says, "Okay, let's go." And then they say, "But hold on, first let me go and say goodbye to my family." And then we get this response from Jesus that sounds pretty harsh, right? He says, "Anybody that turns back and look isn't fit for the kingdom of God." Now, on one level, this passage seems to be about commitment. How committed are we to the following of Jesus that we are invited to do? Commitment's a tricky thing. I was not committed to the high dive just then. Eventually, I would jump off it. And eventually, just a few years ago, I actually was committed to learning how to swim for my cardiovascular health. And I did learn to swim laps, and my cardiovascular health was fantastic. But I wasn't so committed that I wanted to keep into the pool, so now I do other things because I'm committed to the health, not to the water, right? And commitment can be tricky like this. On the one hand, I think it's really important that we keep commitments. That's part of what we call integrity. We have congregational values, and one of our congregational values is that we keep our commitments. The biggest one is when we baptize people, right? Especially little ones. We say that we're going to walk alongside for them, pray for them in their faith. The parents promise to raise them in the church. Well, they can't keep their promise if we don't let them have little kids in the church, right? And find ways to walk alongside them and provide them the scriptures and teach them the Lord's Prayer and the 10 Commandments. That's a commitment that we make. And it's important that we keep that commitment. A couple weeks ago, I met with the people from Lutheran Services of Florida and said, "Yeah, we can collect some stuff for refugees, right? You didn't know I was making that commitment, but I did, right?" And then it's important that we keep those commitments so that we can continue to partner with those people that are serving with us to the gospel. Keeping commitments is important, and you probably all know someone who's not great at it. So what do you have to do? Work around them, not trust them with things that really need to get done, right? We know when someone keeps commitments and doesn't. But commitments are complicated because the world changes and we change. I think about the other day my wife and I reading about a couple that had been married for 74 years, right? That's a commitment that they stood up and said, in good and bad, sickness, health, all the rest of that. But there's also people who make that same commitment, full well intending to keep it, and then she finds out that he's abusive. And it gets worse and worse, and it becomes unsafe for her and maybe for children to stay in that space. That's not the commitment that was signed up for, right? And so there are commitments that we have to step away from because the situation turns out to not be healthy and life-giving. And it doesn't have to be marriage. Have any of you ever signed on to a job, and this is what they said the job was, and then you showed up and it was something else? Right? You might have signed a contract, made a commitment, but the commitment wasn't like up front, right? It was misleading. So now you've signed up for something that maybe isn't what you're gifted to do, want to do, can do. And so sometimes you have to step away from that. Sometimes we change. I think about when I was a seminary intern. When you're an intern, you have a team that travels along with you, and they provide feedback and support. And when I got to my internship congregation, the team was formed, mostly people in their 40s and 50s, and I got to add 2 people to it. And one of those people was one of my confirmation leaders, because I was given 7th grade confirmation. He was 75 years old, and since he was going to see me in action in confirmation, it seemed like it would make sense to have him on the team. And before we ever met, we found out that he had a brain tumor and lung cancer. Would it be okay for him to step away from that commitment? No one would blame him for that. Before I could give him that opportunity, I got an email from his wife that said, please don't take this opportunity away from him. He's so committed to it. He really wants to be on this team. And so he was. Did he make all the meetings? Nope. Did he last out the whole year? No, he did not. He ended up dying before we finished out that year, right? Things had changed for him. He couldn't keep the commitment the way he wanted to. He tried to keep the commitment as best he could, and no one would have faulted him for stepping away. Actually, when I went on a trip to Haiti, I came back and they said he had stepped down as the head usher. And you kind of go, well, of course, right? But it was because he wanted to be a congregational deacon and serve communion and do other things, right? He just never stopped moving. He wanted to be in that space. But he was changing. His body was changing. His health was changing. Sometimes the things we commit to, we meet those commitments, or the need for that commitment goes away. My home congregation was planted in 1966 in a space where there was supposed to be a highway off-ramp that came right by it. And that never got built. So they had made a commitment to a space, but the space didn't live up to its promise. Now the congregation stayed there anyway, until about the time I was in high school, the planes that came over from the airport were so loud that we would just have to stop worship sometimes because you couldn't hear anything with all the jets taking off. Eventually the airport had to buy us, and so we moved to a new place, and in that new place continued to be kind of the same church, but in a new neighborhood. And then they decided to expand the airport. Now, there were lots of ways they could have done that. The runways were too close together, and you couldn't land planes as many when it was cloudy. So it would make sense to me to put them over here parallel, right? But that's where McDonnell Douglas, now Boeing, had all of their manufacturing and probably didn't want to give that space up. Over here were 5,000 homes, 5 churches, a school, and a whole bunch of businesses, including family businesses that had been in the neighborhood for decades. And then they began to buy all of that. Now, homeowners were supposed to get fair market value for their house, but what's the market value when your neighborhood's going away? And they're supposed to relocate you to an equivalent kind of neighborhood, but guess what? Those start to get more expensive. Churches, there's not really a precedent for getting treated well, so we figured they were supposed to relocate us in a like neighborhood in our service area for whatever that cost, which we calculated to be about $2.7 million, and they offered us $700,000. Businesses, most of them were tenants, they got nothing, right? The landlord got the money and everybody else went out of business. And so amidst all of this, we had a standing resolution at like 5 or 6 years worth of annual meetings as a congregation where we committed as a congregation to walk alongside the people in the neighborhood that were having to deal with the airport. And we had people that would go sit with seniors that were living all by themselves that didn't know what the paperwork coming at them was and all the things that we're having to deal with, right? This was a commitment that the congregation made. Well, eventually we got bought out, had to move again. All the homes are gone. There's now the church we got married in is like quite a few feet under what is now a runway, right? All of that happened. Well, is there a need for that commitment anymore? No, right? That's done. So then the congregation has to say, well, this is what we were committed to. What are we going to get committed to now? We're in a new part of the neighborhood, surrounded by different people. There was a low-income housing project right next door. New opportunities for new things to commit to. The point of all this is, commitment's complicated. It's important for our integrity that we do the best we can to keep our commitments, but the world changes around us, and sometimes we change, and sometimes the things we commit to turn out not to be what they were, or the circumstances change, and things maybe need to be stepped away from, and that's okay. In today's gospel, I don't think we're actually dealing with commitment, though. As Jesus talks to these people, and they all say, hold on, let me go take care of this thing, it sounds like, if you think about it a certain way, like they're unwilling to commit. But we have this other story we heard this morning from 1 Kings. It begins with Elijah, who's a prophet. Now, being a prophet was not an easy job. If you went into a town and said, does anybody want to be the prophet? Probably no one would raise their hand and say, yep, that's a commitment I want to make. Because, you know, Jesus says a prophet dies in their home, can't go home, right? They get killed, all those kind of things. So before we get to today's story, Elijah, there's two stories that happen. One, there's a famine. God says, go to this widow and ask her to feed you. So his kind of first prophet job is to show up to somebody who has nothing and then say, please feed me. That's not a fun ask to have to make, but God provides. Then there's another story where there's the prophets of Baal. So they're the prophets of a false god. There's 450 of them. And they have this thing that I call the prophet showdown. They build like wood fires, but not fire, and then they have to ask their God to light the fire. And the prophets of Baal can't make that happen, and Elijah does, and then has the 450 prophets of Baal killed. So at this point, my guess is everybody kind of knows who Elijah is after this big deal. And then God tells him to go anoint Elisha as his successor. And so he walks by the field where Elisha is plowing. He takes his mantle off, throws the cape around his shoulders, and just keeps walking. Elisha chases him down, and he somehow knows that something is happening here. And he says, wait, let me first go say goodbye to my parents. Just like the person in the gospel story. Elijah's got a weird response. He's like, what did I do to you? It's almost like it was a test. We'll see if he gets it. And he just keeps moving. But Elisha goes back. And this is where I think this isn't about commitment, but it's about something else. And that something else, I think, is calling. Elisha was not asked to make a commitment to follow Elijah. He was called by God to be the prophet that would succeed him. And calling, I think, is different than commitment. Commitment can change. It can come and go. We may have to step away from things. But a calling is much, much deeper and bigger, right? The commitments can change and all that, but the calling encompasses all of that. And the reason I think it's a calling is because Elisha goes back, but he doesn't actually, we don't hear that he says goodbye to his parents. I think he did. But what does he do? He slaughters the oxen that he was driving, which was probably his livelihood. He takes all of the equipment that they were dragging, builds it into a fire, cooks the oxen, and feeds all of the people there. So he can't go back. He's just taken all of the things that he was doing and destroyed them, but for a purpose. And that purpose is to have this meal with all of those people before he sets off on this new place that he's been called to. He wasn't asked to make a commitment. He was called to be the prophet. And before he went, he paused, had a sacred meal with the people that were around him, and took all those things that he could have gone back to and made sure he could not go back. We don't know what happens to the people in the story that Jesus is talking to, but I don't think he's asking them to simply make a commitment. I think he's calling them to a new way of being. And they maybe don't quite get that yet. I don't bet they went home and destroyed all of the things that were there so that they didn't have a choice but to follow. But I do think they had a calling. And the thing about a calling is it keeps eating at you. Jeremiah was called to be the prophet. I don't know if you know what he said. I'm just a boy. God said, well, you're it. And there's a point where Jeremiah's like, it's burning, like this word of God is burning within me. I can't help. I got to get it out, right? That's a calling. That's not a commitment. Moses called to lead the people out of Israel. That's not a simple commitment. That was a whole life, right? A whole life he was called into to lead them that way. Jesus today, we're told, set his face to Jerusalem. Is that a commitment or a calling? It's a calling, right? You don't go die on the cross because you're just that committed, right? You're called into that. But he knew he was going to come out the other side to new life. And in so, gave us a meal, right? Just as Elisha had a meal before he jumped off on his calling, Jesus dies, but before he dies, gives us a meal that can be a marker of the calling that we have. Like I said, I eventually did jump off the diving board. I didn't tear up all the steps on the way up, though, to make sure I had to. I just eventually got enough nerve to do it. Would I do that today? I don't need to do that anymore, right? But there are commitments that fall within our calling. And while we may not have to jump off the high dive, we can jump right into these waters of baptism. And when we go into these waters of baptism, we say that we both die and rise. The dying is the part where Elisha tears apart all the equipment, burns it, has a sacred meal so that he can enter fully into this calling that he has. When we come into these waters, we die to all of the things that keep us from making healthy commitments and good commitments and living into them, but we die to all the rest of the brokenness we have as well. That 74-year marriage, that wasn't a commitment, right? That's a calling. It's a calling that comes out of these waters of baptism. The way we live into our lives as children of parents is a calling that we have as human beings. The way we live as spouses, the way we live as parents, the way we live as neighbors, the way we live as employees, the way we live as retired people, all of those are part of the calling that we have in these waters of baptism, that we don't go back, right? We move forward. Is that always easy? No, it's usually not, right? And I think what Jesus is trying to say is, come and follow me, because this is the path to life. You can look back. You might even go back and do some things along the way, but let that going back be something that still points forward to this calling that we have. Trusting that Jesus will carry us along, even through the hard parts, and that in these waters we are called to be what Luther called the priesthood of all believers, right? That all of us are God's priestly people, bringing grace and love and mercy to the world each and every day. Amen.